The screen door took the boot hard enough to swing back into the siding with a crack that carried across the empty street. Cardboard boxes tumbled down the porch steps. A coffee mug skipped twice across the concrete and shattered against the walkway edge. A pair of hands shot out and caught a leather jacket before it reached the dirt. Those hands were not delicate. The knuckles were wide and scarred. The skin thickened from 40 years of wrenches and handlebars, from engine heat and road cold, and the particular abuse that comes from doing physical work seriously for a very long time. They belonged to Lola Briggs. She was 75 years old. She did not cry. Two men in matching khaki shirts with a bank logo stitched over the left breast were carrying her life out of the house and stacking it on the front lawn in neat, organized rows. They were professional about it, polite in the way people are polite when they have a task and a schedule and no stake in the emotional weight of what the task involves. They called her ma'am. They asked twice if she needed assistance loading her truck. She said no both times and stood in the driveway with her arms at her sides and watched them work. She had lived in that house for 39 years. She had painted every room herself twice. She had replaced the water heater 3 times and the roof once, doing both jobs with help from people she had trusted enough to let through the door with tools in their hands. She had buried her husband Dale from the front porch on a gray January morning, 18 years ago, standing at the top of the steps and watching the hearse go south down the county road, while the neighbors stood along the fence line with their hats in their hands and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not be smaller than the silence. She had planted the garden along the east fence every spring and let it go in the fall and started again the following spring without needing to decide to. She had rewired the back bedroom rather than pay someone who would do it halfway. The men were careful and systematic. They labeled each box in black marker on the short side so the labels were visible when the boxes were stacked. Bedroom, kitchen, living room, garage. They arranged everything in rows on the lawn, the way a warehouse arranges inventory before it moves, organized and impersonal, which was, she supposed, what her belongings had become. She did not ask them to slow down when they came out with the rocking chair Dale had built in his workshop the year before Weston Monroe next door was born and had given her on their anniversary. Did not say anything when they lifted the dining table where her daughter Harper had done homework every evening all through middle school and high school, where the wood had a specific worn patch near the left edge where Harper had always rested her elbow. She watched. That was all. Watching was the correct thing to do. The leather jacket was the last thing she pulled from the back of the closet before the men arrived. It had been there for years, buried under coats and storage boxes, in the miscellaneous accumulation of a life lived mostly in forward gear. She had not worn it since the last time she rode with the club, which was longer ago than she liked to think about. She put it on in the driveway while the men were still working. The leather was stiff from disuse, but it fit just barely the way a good jacket always fits, even after years of not being worn, because a good jacket is made to your body, and your body changes less than you think it does. She zipped it halfway and felt the weight settle across her shoulders like something she had been missing without knowing it was gone. The patches on the back were faded but readable. Iron Covenant MC Events. Roads. A crest on the left breast that had meant something difficult to earn at a time when earning it actually required something of you. Her road name was Briggs. The Iron Covenant had given it to her in 1979, the year she became the first woman patched into the club, and they had not bothered trying to come up with anything more inventive. She had not argued. She had never been particularly interested in clever. She had run Briggs Motorcycle Repair for 32 years off the county highway a mile east of town. The shop had been a serious business, not a hobby shop, not a weekend side project. She had negotiated with parts suppliers twice her size. She had chased down customers who believed skipping a bill was something they could get away with. She had won those arguments because she had been right, and because being right and being willing to stand in the fact of it was generally enough. She had read contracts before she signed them. She had understood the difference between what a document said and what the person handing it to you wanted you to believe it said, until the one her daughter handed her. That was the detail she could not get past. Not the betrayal, not even the money, though the money had destroyed her. The fact that she had signed a document her own daughter placed in front of her without reading a single word because Harper was crying and her hands were trembling and she had said, "Please, Mom," Just this one time, it is not complicated, just a signature, and Lola had believed her. She had looked at her daughter's face and believed her. Harper's husband, Glenn, had presented it as a temporary problem, a short-term loan to bridge a bad month, a matter of a few weeks, and a small signature, and everything would be fine. Lola had signed, Glenn had taken the money and lost it at a card table in Phoenix inside of 3 months. Then he opened a second line of credit in her name, then a third. He used the equity in the house as collateral on instruments she never saw, forged her signature on documents she would never have agreed to, and drained every account she had, one transfer at a time, spreading it across enough institutions in enough time that it was not visible until it was already done. Then he disappeared. Drove east with $42,000 in cash, and a woman nobody in town had known he knew, and did not call, did not write, did not leave a forwarding address. Harper called once from somewhere in Tennessee, said she would fix it, said to give her time. She never called again. Lola fought the foreclosure for 2 years. She retained attorneys on credit cards she could barely service. She applied to 4 different lenders for refinancing and was turned down by all of them because the fraudulent instruments had done what fraudulent instruments do when they go undetected long enough. She sold the repair shop for less than half its actual value and put every cent of it toward balances that barely moved. She cashed out the retirement account she had been building for 30 years. She sold her tools, one by one, machinery she had owned since before Harper was born, equipment that had built the business and sustained it and that she had never imagined selling. By the time the final foreclosure notice arrived, she was working part-time at an auto parts counter for $11 an hour just to keep the lights on. It was not enough. None of it was enough. The numbers were too large and her income was too small, and by the time everything was counted, the outcome was already determined. She stood in the driveway until the men were finished and thanked them, because that was the correct thing to do, and she had not stopped doing the correct thing simply because other people had stopped. The younger of the two looked at her with something in his face that was close to actual guilt, as though he understood on some level that the job he was doing had weight beyond its logistics. She did not respond to it. She nodded once and turned toward the motorcycle parked at the edge of the driveway. It was a 1974 Harley Shovelhead. The red faded to something close to copper. The black trim gone to dark gray over the years of sun and road. The carburetor had a slow fuel leak that made it run rich when the weather turned cold. The kickstart had grown stiffer every winter for the past 5 years. One cylinder ran slightly rough on long grades, but it ran. On a good day, it ran clean and smooth, and it went where she pointed it. She swung her leg over the seat and settled her weight in. The frame shifted under her, the leather creaked, the whole machine groaned the way old things groan when asked to wake up and remember what they were made for. She put her boot on the kicker and came down on it. Once, nothing. Twice, a cough and a long, unhelpful silence. Third kick. The engine caught. It stuttered twice and then opened up into the deep rolling sound she had known for 50 years. The sound that pushed against the chest from inside and reminded you that controlled combustion was still the most reliable miracle available to a person on a budget. She did not look at the men on the lawn. She twisted the throttle, felt the shovelhead answer, and rode. The county road took her north past the strip mall, where she had bought groceries on Thursdays for 2 decades, past the diner, where she had eaten breakfast on Saturday mornings since before Harper was born, past the high school, where Harper had played softball in a jersey that was always one size too large, the number barely legible on the back. Past the cemetery where Dale Briggs was buried under a flat granite marker that said his name and the years he had lived. Because when the time came to write something for the stone, Lola had found that everything she wanted to say was too large for stone, and so she had let the facts stand in for everything else. She did not stop at any of it. She kept the throttle steady and let the wind pull the heat out of her face and do what wind does when you ride, which is to say, it clarifies everything that does not need to be carried. The houses fell away as the road climbed north into the high desert above town. Scrub brush replaced the lawns and the concrete in the maintained edge of a place where people kept things up. Red rock formations rose on both sides of the road, like things that had been watching from before there were people to watch them and would be watching long after. The air was dry and clean and smelled of sage and warm dust and the faint sweetness of creosote after the previous night's rain. She rode for 40 minutes past the point where the road she knew well gave way to a road she knew only from visits she could count on one hand, until the pavement ended at a cattle gate and a dirt track wound away through the brush, with no signs posted and no markers set, just a road leading somewhere specific that nobody else would know to look for. The property was at the end of the track. 5 acres of Arizona hillside her grandmother Hope had purchased in 1947 for almost nothing back when that land was worth approximately what you paid for it and nothing more. There was no house on the property. There had never been a house. There was one structure, a concrete block garage, 20 by 40 feet, heavy steel door. No windows. It had been painted white at some point decades in the past. Now it was the color of old concrete, bleached and blistered by the years of desert sun that had taken the paint off in long strips. Hope Briggs had owned and maintained the property until the morning she died in 1998, at 92 years old, writing in a hand so steady in those final months that the letters she left behind looked like they had been written by someone 4 decades younger. In her will, she had left the land to Lola, not to Lola's mother, who was still living at the time and who would have been the expected choice, not to Lola's older brother, who had always been the one people expected things to go to Lola specifically, with one condition written on a separate piece of paper in Hope's precise and unhurried script. Do not open it until you have nothing left. Lola had read that line in the lawyer's office 26 years ago and had nearly laughed. Her grandmother had always operated that way, in riddles and long silences, with a quality of attention that suggested she was watching something at a great distance that nobody else in the room could see. For 26 years, the garage had sat on the hillside, and Lola had paid the property tax on it every year, $210 out of stubbornness, more than any clear plan, because it was there and her grandmother had left it, and that meant it deserved $210 a year, whether or not Lola understood why. She had driven up the track maybe 4 times over those years, stood in front of the padlock, looked at it for a while, and driven back down. She had never put the key in. Now she had nothing. She killed the engine and let the desert silence settle around her the way it settles when you have stopped making noise, complete and immediate and very large. Wind moved through the dry grass along the back wall. A hawk turned slow circles overhead on broad wings, held flat against the pale afternoon sky, looking down with the patience of something that knows it will eventually find what it is looking for. Lola sat on the bike without moving for a moment. She had $83 in her jacket pocket. She had the shovel head, which was probably worth something to the right buyer, and nothing at all to her as a thing to sell. And she had the key. It had been on a thin chain around her neck since the day the lawyer handed it over after the will reading. Brass gone nearly black with age, but still correct in its shape, the teeth still clean and sharp. She lifted it over her head and held it in her palm and looked at it. Then she got off the bike and walked to the garage door. Boots loud on the gravel, her shadow long and thin across the concrete, in the late afternoon light that was already going warm and orange at the edges. She did not feel hope. She felt the kind of tired that builds up over years of fighting something larger than yourself. The particular tiredness that comes from being knocked down until the bracing for it becomes more exhausting than the falling. Whatever was inside this garage, she told herself it was not going to undo what had been done. That was what she believed when she slid the key into the lock. She was wrong about that, but she did not know it yet. The key turned smooth and clean, as though the lock had been serviced recently rather than left untouched for 26 years. The hasp dropped off with a metallic ring that carried clearly across the hillside and faded into the desert in a long, slow, diminishing echo. She stood with her hand on the door for a moment, listening. There was nothing to hear except the wind and the faint ticking of the shovelhead's engine cooling behind her. She pulled the door open. The hinges screamed rust, ground against rust, a sound like something being dragged out of a long sleep against its will. A wall of old sealed air rolled out of the darkness into her face, dense and dry and strange, the air of a space that had not breathed in over 2 decades. She stepped inside. The only light came from the open door at her back. Shapes emerged slowly from the dimness as her eyes adjusted. Tall shapes arranged along the walls, flat shapes stacked on shelves, and in the center of the floor, a long, low shape under a heavy canvas tarp that had stiffened with age. She found the breaker panel mounted near the door frame, a gray metal box with a single main switch, and she threw it. Fluorescent tubes overhead stuttered and caught one by one, blinking into life with that particular mechanical uncertainty before they held and filled the space with cold white light that pushed the shadows into the far corners. Lola stopped breathing. The walls of the garage were lined with trophies. Not a few, not a shelf of them. Dozens arranged on wooden shelving that had clearly been built by hand and stained dark and had remained solid through all the years that the structure around it had been bleaching and blistering in the desert. The trophies ranged from small bronze cups that would sit in one hand to tall silver columns nearly as high as her shoulder. Their bases engraved their shapes varying across the decades of competition they represented. The labels on the wooden shelves had yellowed and curled at the edges, but the text was stamped into metal plaques on each trophy and remained readable. First place, women's class, national champion, Daytona Beach Sand Course 1937, Wisconsin T 1938, Pikes Peak Hill Climb 1940, Springfield Mile 1939, Middleburg Circuit 1941. She walked slowly along the nearest wall, reading each date, reading each event, name reading each small engraved plate at the base of every trophy. The name on every single one was identical. Hope Briggs, Hope Briggs, Hope Briggs. Lola turned in a slow circle in the center of the room and looked at all of it. Her grandmother had been a motorcycle racer, not a hobbyist who entered the occasional local event for the fun of it, not a weekend enthusiast who liked the feeling of speed on a closed circuit. A champion, a national champion across multiple circuits, across multiple consecutive years, in an era when women were not supposed to be anywhere near a motorcycle at competitions. Speed, when the simple act of showing up at a starting line required a level of determination most people would not have called courage because they had no frame of reference for what it cost. Lola had been riding motorcycles since 1967. She had spent 3 decades running a serious repair shop dealing with riders and collectors and mechanics and dealers from across the country. She had attended major rallies and vintage events and had spent long hours in conversation with people who could trace the complete competitive history of nearly every significant rider from the pre-war era. Forward people who had dedicated their lives to knowing this history and preserving it. She had never once heard the name Hope Briggs spoken in any connection with any of it. She turned toward the back wall and felt the breath go out of her a second time. Photographs covered the entire back wall from floor to ceiling, edge to edge, hung so close together that only the narrow strips of wall paint between frames remained visible. Black and white prints, some sepia toned with age, some sharp, high contrast later, film stock. A young woman in leather breeches and goggles, standing beside a long, low motorcycle with a wide front tire and a big displacement engine, looking at the camera, with an expression that suggested the camera was incidental to more important things she had to do. The same woman at full lean on a dirt oval, the rear wheel throwing a wide wall of earth, her body pressed flat over the tank, the machine nearly parallel to the ground. The same woman standing on a victory podium, accepting a trophy from a man in a suit, while the crowd behind her was divided between people cheering and people whose expressions said something had gone wrong with the natural order of things. Every photograph was hope. At 20, at 25, at 32, a life that Lola had never known existed in the woman she had visited on holidays and received long letters from and never fully understood. She walked to the center of the room and stood in front of the canvas tarp. She did not need to look under it to know what was there. The shape told her. The upward arc of a fuel tank. The circle of a wire-spoked wheel. She gripped the edge of the tarp and pulled it back. The motorcycle underneath was the most extraordinary machine she had ever seen in 57 years of being around motorcycles. An Indian 4, not a reproduction, not a period-correct restoration, assembled from a mix of original and reproduced parts. Not a machine rebuilt from a stripped frame with donor pieces collected across decades. An original, complete, unrestored 1936 Indian 4, and it had not faded a single shade from the day it was finished because no sunlight had ever reached it in the sealed garage. The cherry red paint was as deep and saturated as the day it was applied, a color that looked almost luminous under the fluorescent lights. The chrome was not merely present but flawless, every surface intact, every detail preserved. The leather saddle had cracked in places across the long, dry years, but remained whole and shape still, carrying the subtle contour of the body of the rider who had last sat in it. The fuel tank was hand-painted thin gold pinstriping running around a central white panel, and inside that panel, in clean, confident numerals, the number 9. A small brass plate was riveted to the frame near the engine cases. Indian Motorcycle Company. Springfield, Massachusetts, 1936. Lola knew what this was worth. Anyone serious in the vintage motorcycle world knew what a correct, unrestored 1936 Indian 4 was worth in the current market. They came to public auction perhaps once in a decade, sometimes less. The last one she had followed had sold for $490,000, and it had not been in this condition. She did not sit on the seat. It felt like the kind of thing you did not do without being invited first. There was a workbench along the far wall of the garage. On it sat an oil can and a row of carburetor jets arranged in order by size, in a plain wooden box with no finish on it, roughly the dimensions of a shoebox. She walked to the box and lifted the lid. Inside were a journal bound in black leather, a stack of envelopes tied with cotton string, a racing patch worn thin at the edges, a gold pocket watch with a scratched crystal face, and a sealed envelope with her name written on the front in Hope's handwriting. Lola, just that. She sat on the workbench. Dust rose up around her legs. She could hear her own heartbeat in the stillness of the sealed room. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was dated August 1997. Hope had been 91 years old when she wrote it. Lola, if you are reading this, you have nothing left. I am sorry. I knew this moment might come for you. The Briggs women have always been harder on themselves than on the people who damage them. I was the same. Your mother was the same. I hope your daughter is different, but I am not certain she is, and I think someone may have hurt her before she found a way to hurt you. I am leaving you what I have. Number 9 was my finest machine. She belongs to you now. There are letters in this box from a man who tried to take her from me. His son is still alive, and he knows this property exists. He will come the moment he learns it has been opened. Be ready. Look underneath the workbench. There is more than what you can see from where you are sitting. Love, Grandma. Lola read it twice. She picked up the gold pocket watch. It was inexplicably warm in her palm, as though it had been sitting in afternoon sunlight rather than sealed in a dark room for over 2 decades. She wound it 3 careful turns. The mechanism inside clicked and engaged. The second hand began to sweep. She set the watch on the bench beside her and looked at the Indian 9 across the room. She set it quietly to the empty garage. All right, Grandma, all right. Then she went to the far end of the workbench. There was a steel toolbox sitting at the corner, old and heavy, the standard kind. She lifted it aside. Beneath it, set into the surface of the workbench itself, was a small brass ring. Just a ring flush with the wood, the kind used as a pull handle. She tugged on it. A section of the bench top swung upward on a concealed hinge, revealing a hollow beneath. A short wooden ladder was set flush against the interior wall of the hollow, 3 rungs descending into darkness. She found a light switch inside the frame of the opening and clicked it. The space below lit up. It was the size of a large closet lined entirely with cedar planks that had kept their moisture and their smell through all the years the rest of the structure had been drying in the desert heat. The planks had been fitted carefully, the corners tight, the shelves that lined 3 walls built with the same attention to craft that had gone into the shelving upstairs. The shelves were full. She pulled the oilcloth from the nearest item and knew it immediately. A frame, a Crocker, a 1939 Crocker motorcycle frame, the most sought-after production motorcycle chassis ever built in America, from a production run so limited that fewer than 100 complete original machines were believed to survive. The last Crocker she had tracked at public auction had sold for over $700,000. She pulled the cloth from the next piece and recognized it from photographs she had studied years ago. A Browse Superior fuel tank, wide and elegantly proportioned, with the distinctive linework of the Superior series. The kind T.E. Lawrence had been riding on the road in Dorset when he was killed. She pulled another cloth back. A complete, unrestored Vincent Black Lightning engine, every original part present and correctly identified by the small handwritten tags Hope had tied to each one. Lola sat down on the cedar floor of the cellar and put both hands over her face. Her grandmother had spent 40 years quietly and methodically gathering the most significant pieces of American and British motorcycle history at the precise period when nobody else understood what they would one day represent. She had bought them when they were cheap, when the men who owned them were selling them as obsolete scrap or disposing of them as inherited objects with no clear use, when the entire category of pre-war American performance machines was considered an interesting footnote rather than a serious area of preservation. She had wrapped every piece in oilcloth, labeled each one in her own hand, and stacked them on cedar shelves in a concrete building sealed against the desert in a location nobody would look. She had been doing this alone for 4 decades and had not told a living soul. There was a small ledger on the bottom shelf. Lola opened it. Every piece was listed in the same careful hand. Date acquired, price paid, provenance, condition notes. At the bottom of the final page in pencil, dated 1997. Whatever this is worth, it is hers now. Use it well. Lola climbed back up the ladder and closed the trapdoor and sat on the bench and looked at the Indian 9 standing under the fluorescent lights in the center of the garage. She thought about what kind of woman could have done all of this and kept it entirely quiet for 60 years. She thought about all the conversations they had not had, about all the times she had sat with Hope over a Sunday dinner or a cup of coffee and talked about ordinary things while her grandmother sat across from her and watched her with that particular look and said nothing about any of this. She picked up the journal from the wooden box and opened it to the first page. Hope had started it in January 1934, the year she bought the Indian 4, from a dealership in Phoenix with money she had saved for 2 full years, working as a seamstress in the evenings after her day job at a textile warehouse. The first entry was 4 lines. Paid $215 for the Indian. Rode her home over the Bradshaw Mountains in the rain. Nobody thought I would make it over the pass. I made it. The entries expanded from there, the handwriting loosening as Hope found her way into the practice of it. The first race, a county fair circuit in Wisconsin in the summer of 1935, where she had registered as H. Briggs because the circuit would not accept a women's entry, and she had decided that being told she could not enter was a different thing from actually being prevented. She had kept her helmet on until she had crossed the finish line, and the man at the flag had already written down the results. The registration clerk had recognized her behind and tried to wave her off the starting grid. She had gone around him and won by 14 seconds. The next entry described a crash the following season at 40 miles an hour, a dislocated shoulder and a broken collarbone, and finishing the race before she would allow anyone near her. She had written it the same way she wrote about a fuel mixture adjustment. Lola read until her eyes ached, and she looked up and saw that the sky outside the open door had gone deep blue, and the first stars were already present overhead. She had completely lost track of time, which had not happened to her in months. She stood and stretched her back and walked to the wooden box and untied the letters. The first envelope was dated November 1962. Inside was a letter in Hope's hand. Thaddeus Gallagher came to the property today with a business partner and offered $12,000 for the Indian. He was polite in the way that certain men are polite when they are confident that politeness will produce the outcome they have already decided on. He told me he had been at Daytona Beach in 1937. He told me he had been standing at the finish line when I came across it first. He said that was the day he saw the machine and decided he wanted it, and that he had been trying to acquire it ever since, and that he was puzzled that I had not been willing to discuss it. I told him the machine was not for sale. He told me I did not understand what I had. I told him I understood exactly what I had. He told me I would think about it differently with time. I told him to leave my property. He left. But men like Thaddeus Gallagher do not stop wanting something simply because they have been told no. He will be back. I am writing this down in case. She found the next letter. 1971, same hand. Gallagher returned today. He brought 2 men with him and a document claiming a bank lien against this property, a debt from a loan he says I took out in 1968 that I have no record of taking. The sheriff looked at the document and could not verify it. The notary stamp was real, but the commission number traced to a different instrument filed in a different name in 1965. The sheriff was polite, but the document was a forgery. Gallagher's men left when the sheriff told them to. Gallagher himself stood in this clearing for a moment before he went and looked at the garage door with an expression I recognized from the first time he came. He will be back again. He has built a bank since 1962. I do not know where the original capital came from. I have my suspicions, and I have written them on the enclosed pages and had them notarized by a party with no connection to any of this. I am keeping this record in case. The Briggs women have always been harder on themselves than on the people who damage them. I do not intend to let that be true here. Lola was still reading through the letters one by one when she heard the sound. 2 engines on the dirt road below. Not motorcycles. Trucks, both of them moving fast up the track. She set the letters down and walked to the doorway. 2 black pickup trucks lifted high on oversized tires, bright headlights, cutting through the last of the afternoon light. They came up the dirt road without slowing and pulled into the clearing in front of the garage with the confidence of people who have already decided how a situation is going to go. Four men stepped out. Three of them were large and wore jeans and work boots and had the look and the posture of men paid to be present in a way that is intended to communicate something specific about what will happen if things go wrong. The fourth man she recognized. She had seen his face on a billboard along the county highway north of town, the kind of billboard that displayed a name in large letters above a logo, the kind that was intended to communicate established presence and community investment. Robert Gallagher, younger than her by 15 years, broad-shouldered, expensive haircut, a suit jacket worn open over a collared shirt in the way that men wear suits when they want to seem accessible, while still communicating that they are in a position of authority. He walked toward her across the gravel with his hand extended and his expression arranged into something that suggested a reasonable conversation was about to take place. Mrs. Briggs, Robert Gallagher, Gallagher Development Group. I believe we may have spoken by phone some months back. We did not speak, you left a message. He lowered his hand smoothly as though that had been expected. He looked around the clearing with the expression of a man estimating. I will be direct. My understanding is the county may be moving to condemn this parcel for environmental liability from prior industrial use. I would hate to see you lose the land without any compensation when there is a fair offer available. I can offer $40,000 cash transaction close within the week. You walk away clean and avoid any cleanup liability that might otherwise come your way. He paused and watched her to see how the number landed. Lola looked at him. She looked at the three men by the trucks who had not moved and whose stillness was a specific kind of stillness. She looked back at Gallagher. You know what is in this garage? His expression adjusted the way a mask adjusts when the face behind it does something the mask was not prepared for. I'm sorry, I am not sure what you mean by that. You know what is inside this garage, she said again. You would not be here otherwise. Your father stood in the same spot in 1971 with a forged bank document and two men very similar to those three. My grandmother wrote down everything, every visit, every document, every threat, every name. She had it notarized. I have all of it. The expression was entirely gone. Mrs. Briggs, this is a business conversation. Get off my property. One of the three men stepped forward from the trucks, the largest of them wide across the shoulders, a scar through one eyebrow, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who wants the movement to be interpreted correctly. Lola looked at him for 2 seconds. Then she looked back at Gallagher and pulled an old flip phone from her jacket pocket. You have 60 seconds to be back in those trucks. After that, I make a call. The people who answer are not in suits. Nobody moved for a long moment. The wind pushed dry dust across the clearing. Then Gallagher turned to his men and said 2 words, and they walked back to the trucks and got in. The engine started. They backed slowly down the dirt road in a low cloud of dust, and their headlights disappeared around the first bend. Lola stood in the clearing with the phone in her hand and did not put it away. She dialed a number she had not used in 11 years. It rang twice. A voice answered deep and rough like gravel moving down a slope. Briggs, you still breathing? Yeah, Deacon, still here. What do you need? 8 or 10 riders at my grandmother's property by sunrise. I will send you the location. The line was quiet for 3 seconds. What kind of trouble? Suits, with lawyers behind them. A pause. Lock the garage door. We will be there before it gets light. He hung up. Lola put the phone in her pocket and stood in the clearing, looking down the road where the trucks had gone. She thought about her grandmother standing in the same spot in November 1962, watching a man named Thaddeus Gallagher drive away after being told no for the first time, watching him go with the understanding that he was going to come back. Hope had been right about that. She had been right about most things. Lola turned back into the garage. She had a journal to finish reading and a night to get through. She read until the sky outside the open door had gone completely dark and the desert night was making its particular sounds, small sounds, in the sage, the distant call of something in the canyon to the east, the ticking of the shovelhead's engine outside going through its final cooling contractions. The journal entries from the war years began in the spring of 1942, when the racing circuits shut down for the duration, and Hope wrote about it the way you write about a death that was expected and still cost you something. Then in March of 1943, the entries changed in tone and in content, and Lola sat up straighter and read more carefully. Her grandmother had been recruited, not by the military, not in any official capacity that left a record, but by the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence agency that would eventually become the CIA. They needed couriers, people who could move classified materials across large distances without drawing attention, people who understood remote roads, people who could navigate terrain that did not appear on standard maps and could do it reliably across all weather and all conditions. People specifically who were overlooked. Nobody suspected a woman on a motorcycle of carrying anything important. Nobody looked twice. Hope had spent 3 years riding number 9 across the Southwest corridor. Arizona to California, New Mexico to Nevada, mountain routes and desert tracks that she memorized and never wrote down, saddlebags and frame compartments. She had modified herself to specifications that were not in any manual. Classified documents, technical materials, things whose nature the journal described only obliquely. She had been good enough at it to be recognized for it 3 times quietly, officially off the record. Lola set the journal down and reached into the wooden box. At the very bottom beneath everything else was a small velvet pouch she had not noticed before. She opened it. 3 medals tarnished but complete, each one stamped with an eagle and a date. She laughed out loud, a short, sharp sound that bounced off the concrete walls and came back to her from the corners of the room. Her grandmother, the strange, quiet woman with the long silences and the distant eyes who had grown things in her garden and kept chickens and taught Lola to change a tire at age 9, and had never across all the years of Lola's life said a single word about any of this. She had been a champion. She had been a spy. She had preserved a piece of history that nobody else had cared enough to save, and had hidden it in the desert, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. She had known Lola would be the one who needed it. Lola kept reading. The journal named Thaddeus Gallagher in detail that went beyond the letters. She had tracked his financial movements through public records over the years, had documented the pattern of the Gallagher money back to its origins, had made a careful case in her small handwriting on the pages of a journal that nobody had read for 26 years. She read until she heard the motorcycles coming up the dirt road. Not trucks this time. Motorcycles, many of them moving in the slow, deliberate procession that a group of experienced riders makes when they are going somewhere specific and do not need to hurry. She walked to the doorway. The first headlight appeared around the bend. Then a second, then more behind it, a long string of lights moving through the scrub brush in the sage in the darkness. She had asked for 8 or 10. This was not 8 or 10. Silas Hogan, who everyone in the Iron Covenant called Deacon, was at the front on a Road King so old the chrome had gone to silver. He pulled into the clearing and cut the engine. The riders fanned out behind him and killed their engines one at a time. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had heard all day. Deacon swung off the bike and walked to her. Late 50s gray starting at the jaw, wide shoulders, a leather vest covered in patches that matched the ones on her own jacket. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her face the way someone looks when they are actually looking at another person rather than at the impression they are making. "You have been crying, Briggs. Number." "Yeah." He stepped forward and put an arm around her for a moment the way people do when there is nothing to say that words would not make smaller than it deserves. He smelled like road and engine oil and tobacco, like every mile they had ever ridden together. When she stepped back, she pointed at the garage. "You need to see what is in there." He walked in first. The Iron Covenant filed in behind him, men and women with gray at their temples and decades behind their eyes, all of them in colors. Nobody spoke. Deacon stood in front of the Indian 9 for over a minute without moving. Bonnie Mercer, who the club called Rampart, moved slowly along the wall of trophies, reading each date, reading each engraved name. When she reached the last one, she turned back toward Lola with her hand pressed flat over her mouth. "Hope Briggs," she said quietly. "I have read that name, old racing publications, vintage circuit histories going back to the 30s. I never knew what had become of her. I never knew any of this existed." Lola kept her voice steady. "She ended up here. She left it to me, and someone is trying to take it." Deacon turned around slowly. He looked at Lola for a moment with an expression that had made many people in many situations understand that the conversation was over and the decision had been made. Then he pulled out his phone. "No, they are not," he said, and he began making calls. By morning, there were 70 motorcycles in the clearing. By 8 o'clock, a news van had come up the road and parked just past the cattle gate. By 9, Dr. Raymond Weaver from the Smithsonian Institution had arrived in a compact sedan with government plates and was standing in front of the Indian 9 with a magnifying loupe saying nothing at all for a very long time. By noon, Robert Gallagher had come back. He came alone this time in a black SUV with tinted windows, which was probably calculated to make him look reasonable. He stopped halfway up the dirt track when he saw the 70 motorcycles arranged along both sides of the clearing and the news camera being positioned near the gate. He sat in the vehicle long enough for it to mean something. Then he got out. A sheriff's cruiser had come up behind him and stopped on the road. Levi Decker had been the county sheriff for 12 years. Lola had known him when he was a deputy, a young man who took his position very seriously and who sometimes let that seriousness get in the way of thinking through what the position actually required. He had not changed as much as she might have hoped. He got out of the cruiser and they walked up the road together. Mrs. Briggs Decker said, "Mr. Gallagher has a purchase agreement and is claiming the county has initiated condemnation proceedings on this parcel for environmental contamination." "The county has not initiated any such proceedings," Lola said. "I called the clerk's office at 5:30 this morning and confirmed that nothing has been filed under this parcel number." Decker shifted his weight. "The paperwork he has may." "Nothing has been filed," Lola said again, and kept her voice flat. "I also have documentation going back to 1962 showing this family's pattern of using fraudulent instruments to attempt to acquire this property. My grandmother was a careful woman. She kept records, dated, witnessed, and notarized." Gallagher kept his voice measured and his expression controlled. "Mrs. Briggs, I understand you have been through significant difficulties recently. I am not here to cause you further trouble. I am trying to offer you a way forward." Rampart spoke before Lola could answer. Her voice was steady and matter-of-fact, the voice of someone who has done the reading and is reporting what it says. Thaddeus Gallagher filed a fraudulent bank lien against this property in 1971. The sheriff at the time reviewed the document and found it could not be authenticated. The property owner documented the event, the individuals present, in the precise language of the instrument in writing that was subsequently notarized. If Mr. Gallagher has a purchase agreement he would like to present in a legal proceeding, that documentation will be entered in response. Dr. Weaver had come out of the garage and was standing to one side of the clearing, listening. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He was a small man in a gray suit with a leather portfolio and the identification of a major national institution in his breast pocket, and his presence communicated something that Gallagher's 3 trucks and 3 large men had not managed to communicate. Gallagher looked at the Smithsonian curator. He looked at the news camera. He looked at the 70 motorcycles and the rider standing beside them. He looked at the open garage door and the shapes visible inside. He got back in the SUV. He drove away without speaking. Lola walked outside. Dr. Weaver was waiting for her. He had spent the better part of an hour going through the main floor of the garage before Gallagher arrived, examining each trophy individually, reading the dates, studying the photographs on the back wall, with the close, sustained attention of a man who had spent his career searching for exactly this kind of primary evidence. He had produced a small magnifying loupe and spent a long time over the Indian 9 examining the frame plate, the engine case numbers, the paint on the fuel tank, and the pinstriping and the handmade quality of the original tooled leather saddle. He had not spoken while he worked. He had climbed down into the cellar with a flashlight and been silent for a very long time. When he came back up and turned to face her, his voice was precise and professionally controlled. "Mrs. Briggs, this is Hope Briggs' race machine from the 1937 Daytona Beach event. I have seen period photographs of this motorcycle in the archives and in publication. I did not know it had survived. The Smithsonian has been searching for significant pre-war women riders' machines for over a decade. This is the most significant such machine I have encountered in my professional career." He paused. "The collection in the cellar represents a level of pre-war American and British motorcycle preservation that I did not believe existed privately. Your grandmother understood exactly what she was doing, and she did it correctly." He named a figure for acquisition of the Indian 9 alone. He also described a long-term loan arrangement that would keep the motorcycle in her ownership while displaying it at the institution on a rotating basis. The number for either option was more money than she had earned in her last decade of running the shop. She did not react. She did not say yes. "I will consider it," she said. "Let me tell you about the cellar pieces separately." They sat at the workbench and she described each item and he listened and asked careful questions. When she was finished, he made an offer for specific pieces in the cellar, not everything, the pieces that would serve the institution's collection most directly. The Crocker frame, the Vincent engine, the Brow Superior fuel system, several others whose provenance Hope had documented clearly enough to meet the institution's standards. The combined figure was significant, not what the Indian would bring, but enough. Enough to clear every fraudulent account Glenn had opened in her name, enough to pay the lawyers who had fought the foreclosure and lost, enough to leave something behind after the debts were settled. "I will give you an answer in 3 days," Lola said. "The Indian is not part of this conversation." Dr. Weaver nodded as though this was the answer he had expected. He gave her his card, shook her hand, and left. Lola walked out to the clearing. Gallagher's SUV was long gone. Decker was still standing by his cruiser, looking at his phone, looking like a man who would rather be somewhere else. She walked to him. "That condemnation report," she said. "Someone in the county office generated a false report with false information about this parcel. That is worth looking into carefully." Decker looked at her sideways. "You think someone in the office?" "I think the Gallagher family has been operating in this county for 50 years, and that the county office is not made of different people than the rest of the county. That is what I think." He left without arguing. The news van packed up an hour later. The Iron Covenant began to clear out through the afternoon riders with lives to return to people who had come when it mattered and stayed until it was settled. Deacon stayed. Rampart stayed. A handful of others who had nowhere they were required to be. 3 days later, Lola called Dr. Weaver and agreed to sell the cellar pieces he had identified. Not the Indian, not the trophies, not the photographs, not the journal, not the medals from the velvet pouch. The pieces in the cellar were enough for everything that needed clearing. She settled the debts methodically. Every fraudulent account, the legal bills, the collection agencies that had been calling for 2 years. When it was done, she had enough left for a down payment on a small house at the bottom of the dirt road below the garage. 1 bedroom, a porch that faced east toward the hill, a yard that was mostly gravel and sage, and a single old juniper tree. It was the first place that had felt genuinely hers in a very long time. She spent the following weeks working on the garage itself, doing the maintenance it had needed for years and that nobody had done because nobody had known it needed doing. Patched the roof where the concrete had cracked and let the desert in. Painted the interior walls. Replaced the old humming fluorescents with clean new fixtures. Built fresh shelving for the trophies and cleaned each one by hand using a mixture of oil and a soft cloth, working slowly, not rushing, polishing the brass and silver until each one caught the light the way it had been designed to catch it. She rematted the photographs and hung them back on the wall in a careful grid. Hope at 20, at 25, at 30, at 35. A life captured in black and white and held still against the wall of a concrete garage on a hillside in the Arizona desert. Lola stood back and looked at them when they were done and thought about what it meant to know someone your whole life without knowing who they were. She built a low wooden platform for the Indian 9 sanded and finished stable and level, and she made a placard. Simple and clean. Indian 4, 1936. Daytona Beach, 1937, national champion. Number 9, Rider Hope Briggs. This machine is not for sale. She painted a sign for above the door. Hope Briggs Workshop, established 1947. The right people started coming. Not crowds, not tourists interested in a novelty. The right people. Riders who had heard about the Indian and wanted to see it with their own eyes. Collectors who had read about the Smithsonian acquisition and understood what it signified. Historians who wanted to see the trophies and the photographs and talk about what they meant. Lola let them in and walked them through and told them what she was still learning herself about the woman who had built this place. Then one afternoon, a woman arrived with a boy. He was 14 years old, thin and quiet in the way of someone who has learned that being quiet costs less than most of the alternatives. He stood a step behind his mother when they came through the door and kept his eyes down until they were inside the garage, and he looked up and saw the Indian 9, and then he did not look away from it again. The mother introduced herself as Mrs. Monroe. Her son Weston loved motorcycles and had no one to teach him, and she had heard that Lola used to run a shop. Lola looked at the boy. He was still looking at the Indian with the focused attention of someone who has found the specific thing they were looking for without knowing they were looking for it. "You know anything about engines?" Lola asked. He shook his head without looking at her. You want to? He nodded. Lola looked at the mother, then back at the boy. Come back tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Wear clothes you do not mind ruining. Weston Monroe arrived the following morning at 7:40. Lola put him to work, taught him to clean a carburetor properly and to gap a spark plug and to listen to an engine with the specific attention that allows you to hear what it is telling you before it fails rather than after. He did not say much. He watched and he listened and he did what she showed him. After 2 weeks, she taught him to rebuild a carburetor from its component parts. After a month, he could do it without being told to. She started paying him a small amount each week. Not much, enough to make it official, enough so that showing up every day meant something beyond just wanting to be there. 3 more apprentices arrived over the following months. Lacey, a welder from Tucson, who had been doing fabrication work at a construction outfit and who could cut a frame with a torch and put it back together stronger than it started. Donna, who had left engineering school 2 semesters before finishing her degree and whose understanding of mechanical systems from first principles was the clearest Lola had encountered in 30 years. Harrison, who had been a field mechanic in overseas service and who worked on engines the way a person works on things when failure has real consequences, carefully and without shortcuts. They turned the garage into a working shop, American iron from before 1960, Harley and Indian, and anything else that came through the door with real history in its frame. They took it in and tore it down and rebuilt it and made it run. Some machines stayed, some went to museums, some went to collectors who understood what they were buying. The work was demanding, the pay was not extravagant, but it was correct in a way that the auto parts counter had not been, in a way that nothing in the past 2 years had been. Weston barely spoke during the first month. Then one afternoon he asked a question about valve timing, and after that he did not stop. He was at the shop before it opened in the morning and often still there when Lola locked up. He absorbed whatever she showed him and went looking for more on his own time. She recognized something in him. The kind of kid who only makes sense when there is grease under the fingernails and a specific problem to solve. She gave him more responsibility. Let him lead a full rebuild on a 1948 panhead, watching without intervening unless he asked. By the time he was 6 months in, he was doing work that most trained mechanics would not have attempted. But Lola still had not ridden the Indian. She told herself it was too valuable, too fragile, too historically significant to risk on a dirt road. She knew that was not the real reason. The real reason was that she was afraid not of damaging the machine, not of the road, but of what she would feel when she finally swung a leg over that saddle. Afraid she would not be equal to it. Afraid that after everything her grandmother had been, after all those trophies and all those roads and the 3 medals in the velvet pouch, that Lola would sit on the Indian 9 and feel ordinary. So the machine sat on this platform in the center of the room every day, and every day she walked past it and felt the weight of something left unfinished, pressing against her chest. Deacon noticed. He always noticed. He showed up on a Saturday morning in October without calling ahead, just the sound of his Road King coming up the track, and then his boots in the doorway. He looked at the Indian. He looked at Lola under a 1952 Hydroglide working on the oil pan. He leaned against the wall. She slid out and wiped her hands on a rag and did not say anything. Deacon picked up the journal from the shelf where it sat behind glass and opened it to the last page and read it out loud. Number 9 belongs on the road, not behind glass, on the road. That is what she was built for. He closed the journal and set it back precisely where it had been. I will be here tomorrow, 6 in the morning. If you want to ride, we ride. If you do not, that is your business. But stop pretending you are protecting the machine. You are protecting yourself. He walked out. Weston looked up from the transmission he was rebuilding. His expression was carefully neutral, in the way of someone who heard everything and is deciding what to show. "You gonna do it," he said. Lola did not answer right away. She picked up the wrench and went back under the Hydroglide. "Tomorrow," she said. She drove home that evening along the county road with the sunset going red and orange over the western hills, and thought about her grandmother, about what it must have cost to be the person Hope Briggs had been at 23 years old, to show up at a starting line in Wisconsin in 1937 and know that the man handing out registration numbers believed she had no right to be there, to sit on the machine and wait for the flag anyway, to know that if she won, it would not end the argument, but that winning was still the right thing to do. She had not learned that from nowhere. She went inside and set her alarm for 5:15. She woke before it. made coffee and drank it black on the porch of the small house while the sky moved from black to deep blue. At 5:30, she walked up the hill. Deacon was already there sitting on the Road King with a cup from a thermos, and his arms folded the way he always waited, as though waiting were just another kind of writing. Rampart was there standing beside her machine, with her silver hair loose in the cold morning air. Weston was leaning against the garage door with his hands in his jacket pockets, which she had not asked him to do, but was not surprised by. He had the brass key in his hand, the one she had given him 4 months ago for opening and closing the shop. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. The lights came on, and the garage was what it always was: trophies on the shelves and photographs on the back wall, and machines at various stages of work on the benches and in the center of the room on the wooden platform number 9. Lola walked to the machine and put her hand on the fuel tank. The paint was cool and perfect under her palm. She had read the journal's section on how the Indian handled until she could have recited it from memory. Number 9 likes a firm throttle and a patient clutch. She does not like to be restrained. She was built to go, and going is what she does best. She wheeled the Indian off the platform and through the door and out into the clearing. The weight of it was always a surprise, heavier than it looked, substantial, and alive in its mass in the way that real machines are alive, in ways that replicas are not. Deacon handed her a helmet without a word. She put it on and pulled on her gloves and zipped the leather jacket. She swung her leg over. The frame settled under her, the suspension taking her weight, the geometry of the machine doing what it was designed to do. She found the foot controls and positioned herself and gripped the bars and put her boot on the kickstart lever and came down on it. First kick, nothing. The engine was cold and needed the time. Second kick, a brief cough, a suggestion of ignition that did not follow through. Third kick, the engine caught. It sounded like nothing she had ridden in 57 years. Not the Harley Thunder she knew in her chest, not the British twin rasp, not any modern thing. Older and deeper and more certain, a sound that had no real equivalent because the machines that made it were almost entirely gone. It settled into an idle she felt through the frame and the bars and the boards at her feet. All at once, the vibration of controlled combustion that was very much present and very much real. She sat for a moment. Then she eased the clutch out and gave the Indian throttle. The machine moved forward, smooth and responsive and absolutely certain of itself, in the way that well-made things are certain when they are doing exactly what they were built for. She rode out of the clearing and down the dirt track, slowly learning the way it steered the weight of the front end, the feedback through the bars over the rough ground. Different from anything she had ridden. More present, more there. The dirt gave way to pavement at the county road. She turned east. The sun was not yet above the ridge, but the sky ahead was turning pale gold at the horizon and deep blue overhead. She gave the Indian more throttle. It responded without hesitation. No stumble, no protest, no lag. It simply ran fast and smooth and absolutely certain, exactly as Hope had described it in the journal, exactly as a machine built for this purpose runs when it is finally allowed to do what it was made for. Lola felt the speed build under her and the wind against the jacket in the desert opening up on both sides, and felt something release inside her chest that she had been holding shut for 2 years. She rode east through the pale gold morning light. She rode the road her grandmother had ridden, or a road like it, the county road east that connected to the mountain passes in the desert corridors Hope had described in the journal, and riding it on number 9 in a morning that was turning gold. She felt the specific and strange sensation of moving along a line that had been drawn before she was born by a woman she had never fully known for a moment exactly like this one. She rode for an hour and 20 minutes without stopping. She thought about a specific line in the journal, one she had read 3 times without quite absorbing it. Hope had written it after the 1939 Springfield Mile, the year she had won by a margin that made the men's class times look at her results twice. She had written, "The road does not ask who you are. It only asks whether you can ride." Lola had been riding for 57 years, and she understood now that understanding a thing and knowing it were not the same condition. She had known that line when she read it. She understood it now, moving through the pale gold desert morning on a machine that had been built for exactly this, with exactly this intention, by people who believed that a machine and a road and a person were 3 things that became one thing when the conditions were right. The conditions were right. When she came back into the clearing, the sun was fully up and warm, and the desert was alive around her. She shut the Indian down and sat in the settling silence with her hands on the bars and felt the vibration fade out of the frame degree by degree. Then she swung her leg off and stood in the gravel. Deacon walked over and stopped a few feet away. His face gave nothing as it never gave anything, which was one of the qualities that had made him effective for 40 years. How was she? She is extraordinary, Lola said. He nodded once. Yeah, she is. Lola pulled off the helmet. She looked at her hands. They were steady. She had not been sure they would be. She walked to where Weston was standing at the edge of the clearing with his hands in his jacket pockets, trying to appear as though he had not been watching every moment of it. She walked up to him and took the brass key from the chain around her neck. The key Hope had left her, the key that had opened the garage and unlocked everything that followed. She held it out and set it in his palm. Lock up tonight, she said, and every night, open up every morning. Take care of this place when I am not here to do it. Weston looked at the key, then at her. What does this mean? It means exactly what I said. You lock up. You open up. You take care of what is here. He closed his fingers around it and held it and did not say anything else, but something in his face showed that he understood the weight of it. She walked back into the garage. The morning light was coming through the open bay now and lighting everything inside the trophies and the photographs and the tools and the machines. She looked at it all and thought about Hope, about Harper, about all the roads that had led here and all the ones that still went forward. For the first time in 2 years, she felt exactly where she was supposed to be. The months that followed built into something that felt permanent in the way that good work feels permanent, not finished but rooted. The garage became known in the specific circles where this kind of thing becomes known. A 1947 Indian chief came in from a barn in New Mexico, 30 years untouched. A 1945 knucklehead arrived from a shed in Utah. A 1950 panhead from the estate of a man whose family had not known what they had. They tore each one down and rebuilt it correctly and made it run. Lacey set up a welding station in the back corner that could fabricate period-correct parts for machines that had not been in production since the Truman administration. Donna established working relationships with collectors in 4 states and with 3 museums that kept a regular flow of significant machines coming through. Harrison became the person that serious restorers in the Southwest called when they had a problem they could not solve. He solved them from a description on the phone without needing to see the machine, which was the kind of knowledge that only comes from doing the work for a very long time under conditions that required it. Weston had turned 15 and was leading rebuilds that most trained mechanics would not have taken on without supervision. He barely spoke unless the subject was engines, and when he spoke about engines, people listened because what he said was accurate and complete. Then on a Thursday in late October, an old sedan came up the dirt road and parked at the edge of the clearing and sat there for a long moment before the door opened. The woman who stepped out was thin in the way that comes from not eating enough for a long stretch. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, her jeans were plain, and her shirt was too light for the desert evening. She stood beside the car with her arms crossed over her chest and looked at the garage and at the motorcycles and finally at Lola standing in the doorway. It took Lola 3 full seconds to recognize her own daughter. Harper had aged a decade in 3 years. The lines at the corners of her eyes were deep now, and her face was hollow at the cheeks in the way that faces get hollow when they have been carrying something heavy for too long. Her hands crossed over her own arms were visibly trembling. She did not move toward the garage. She stood beside the car and looked across the clearing. Lola stepped outside. She walked halfway to the car and stopped. The silence between them had the weight of the specific things it was standing in for. Harper's voice, when she finally used it, was small and careful. Mom. Lola said nothing. I saw the article, Harper said, in the regional paper, about the garage, about grandmother, about what you built here. She stopped. I did not know any of it. About grandmother, about the Indian, about what she left you. You did not ask, Lola said. Harper flinched. No, I did not. A silence that was longer than the first one. I am sorry, Harper said, for the loans, for Glenn, for disappearing. I know it does not fix anything. I know it is not enough, but I needed you to hear me say it in person where you could look at me. Lola looked at her daughter. She saw the guilt, and she saw the exhaustion, and she saw 3 years of carrying something that cannot be put down by running from it because it runs with you. She also saw something that was not performance. She saw someone who had driven a long way to say a true thing and had not turned around before getting out of the car. Where is Glenn? Lola said. Harper shook her head slightly. He left 2 years ago. Took what remained. I have not heard from him. And you have been in Phoenix? Yes, working at a diner, staying week to week. Why now? Because I saw the article and I saw what you had done, and I realized you had fixed it yourself. And I thought at the very least I could come and tell you I was sorry in person, so you could see me say it. Lola was quiet for a long moment. You destroyed my house, she said. Her voice was level, not heated, simply accurate. I know. You destroyed my credit. You watched me sign documents without telling me what was in them. I know. Then you ran away and did not call. Harper's eyes filled. I was too ashamed. I thought if I could fix the money, I could come back and make it right. But I could not fix it. And every month I waited made it harder to come back. And then I saw what you had done without any help from anyone, and I thought at least I can say I am sorry. Lola thought about her grandmother's letter. The Briggs women have always been harder on themselves than on the people who damage them. She thought about what it cost to drive 3 hours and stand in a clearing in front of someone with every right to send you away and say the words anyway, knowing you might be sent away regardless. Come back Thursday, Lola said. Noon, bring nothing and expect nothing. Harper stared at her. I am not saying everything is all right, Lola said. I am saying come back Thursday. Harper nodded. She got back in the car. She drove slowly down the dirt road and Lola watched until the car was out of sight. Then she went back into the garage. Harper came back Thursday at noon exactly. She had brushed her hair. That was the main visible change. Lola was working inside when she drove up. This shop runs on work, Lola said. We have more work than people right now. You will clean, organize, make supply runs, do whatever needs doing. I will pay you what the work is worth. If you are serious about learning the mechanical side, you will learn it. Harper looked at her. You are offering me a job. I am offering you a chance. Those are not the same thing. What is the difference? A job ends when you stop showing up. A chance ends when you waste it. Harper nodded. She came back every day after that. She swept floors and labeled parts and learned the names of things by asking Weston, who answered her questions with the enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting for someone to ask. She made mistakes, and she was corrected, and she listened. She was not naturally mechanical. She was stubborn in the Briggs way, which meant she kept going when stopping would have been easier and more comfortable. 6 weeks after she started, Lola walked into the garage and found Harper at the parts bench with a carburetor disassembled in front of her, the components laid out in the correct sequence of disassembly, a diagram open beside her, a yellow notepad with careful handwriting showing her process. I took it apart to understand how it works, Harper said. Is that all right? Put it back together, even if I got something wrong. Did you? Harper looked at the diagram, then at the components. I do not think so. Then find out. It took her an hour and 15 minutes. Lola examined the result and found 2 small errors, handed it back without comment, watched Harper locate them and correct them and hand it back again. This time it was right. Put it in the panhead. Harper's hands were not entirely steady as she installed the carburetor. She consulted the diagram twice. She went slowly and did not ask for help. When she stepped back, Lola reached past her and started the engine. It caught and ran clean. Harper stood looking at the running engine without moving. Then she turned to Lola. Her eyes were full. I did it. Lola nodded. Yeah, you did. It was the first time in 3 years she had been proud of her daughter. She did not say it out loud. She went back to her own work. Harper understood. 2 weeks after that, the attorney Goss called at 8 in the morning, which was early for him, and meant something had moved. The FBI, he said. They have made contact. They have been running an investigation into Gallagher Development for 14 months. 2 counts of commercial real estate fraud, 1 count of bribery involving a county planning official. He paused. They were already aware of Glenn. Already aware. He has been cooperating with them since November. He provided information implicating Gallagher Development in a scheme that included fraudulent loan instruments of the kind used against you. Information that aligns with what your grandmother documented about Thaddeus Gallagher's financial history going back to the 1960s. Lola looked at the Indian across the garage. She thought about the last page of the journal. Be ready. He will come when he learns she has been found. What does this mean for the property? The civil action Gallagher filed has been stayed by federal order, Goss said. The forged purchase agreement will be entered into the criminal evidence file. The county official who generated the false condemnation report is under investigation separately and has retained a criminal defense attorney. Refer all of it to them, Lola said. Let them see the full pattern together. After the call, she sat with the phone in her hand and looked around the garage. The trophies, the photographs, the machine that had been hidden here for 60 years waiting for the right moment and the right person. She thought about her grandmother at 90 still writing in a steady hand, still believing this day would come. Hope had been right. She had been right about most things. The months that followed resolved the way things resolve when the groundwork has been laid with precision and patience. Robert Gallagher was indicted on 31 counts. The forged purchase agreement was entered as evidence and traced to a document preparer with a history of producing fraudulent instruments for real estate transactions. The county employee who had generated the false condemnation report resigned and accepted a plea agreement. The civil action against the property was dismissed. The fraudulent credit accounts were adjudicated through the federal process and her record was cleared. It took time, as these things always do, but it resolved completely. Lola followed each development when Goss reported it and acknowledged it and moved on. The property had always been hers. It was still hers. That was the conclusion. The shop kept growing. More machines came in. More skilled people came to work on them. Harper had moved out of the spare room and into a small apartment in town. She came to the shop every day and kept learning. She would never be a master mechanic. She was becoming a capable one, which was honest and sufficient and more than she had been. By the following fall, Lola had 4 full-time apprentices and more work than they could easily manage. She turned nothing away that was worth keeping. The Indian Nine rode regularly once or twice a month early mornings on the empty desert roads east of town. She had stopped being afraid of it. It was a motorcycle built to run, and running was what it did. Then one morning in October, she came into the garage and found Weston standing in front of the Indian, the way he sometimes stood, not working, just present with it. "You all right?" she said. He turned. "Yeah, just thinking about your grandmother, about what she built here and why, about what you are building." She walked over and stood beside him. He held out his hand. In his palm was the brass key. "I think it is time to pass it on," he said. Lola looked at the key. "You earned it. It is yours." He shook his head. "It is not about earning." He said it the way someone says something they have thought through completely before speaking. "It is about what the key is for. Your grandmother held it and gave it to you. You held it and gave it to me. It does not stay with one person. It moves forward. That is what this place is." Lola looked at him for a long time. She thought about Hope writing letters to a granddaughter who had not yet been born, about placing things in boxes and trusting the architecture of time to deliver them, about the instruction written in the careful hand of a 90-year-old woman. She took the key. She knew who was getting it, but that was for later. The next morning came clear and cold and exactly right. Lola was at the garage before 5:30, and the lights were already on, and Harper was inside. She had brought a machine up from the back storage, a 1948 panhead she had been working on for 2 months on evenings and weekends. A smaller bike, a bridge between the shop machines she had been learning on, and something with real miles in its purpose. Harper walked around it 3 times in the way Lola had taught her, looking at the machine from every angle before touching it. She checked the fuel and the oil and the tires and the controls, slowly and without rushing. Then she swung her leg over the seat and sat. She kicked the engine over. On the second try, it caught. She walked the machine outside. She rode in a slow circle around the clearing, then a larger one. Then she went down the dirt track to the county road and turned east and disappeared around the first bend. Lola waited in the clearing. She was gone 40 minutes. When she came back up the road, she was going steadily, and her hands were firm on the bars, and she pulled into the clearing and stopped and sat on the machine for a moment before she stepped off. She walked to Lola with her face flushed and her eyes bright and open in a way they had not been open since she arrived. Lola reached into her jacket pocket and took out the brass key. Harper looked at it. "That is grandmother's key. It has been in this family for a long time," Lola said. "It goes to the person who needs it next." Harper took it in both hands. She looked at it for a long moment and then looked at Lola. Her eyes were full. "What do I do with it?" "You hold it," Lola said, "until someone needs it more than you do." Harper closed her fingers around the key. Then she put the chain around her neck and tucked it under her shirt the way Lola had worn it for a year before she understood what it was for. They walked into the garage together. The others arrived through the morning. Weston and Lacey and Donna and Harrison. Tess, the newest apprentice who had driven down from Flagstaff 2 months ago on her own machine, and who had hands that knew more than her age suggested she had been taught. The shop came alive with the sounds of work beginning. The Indian 9 sat where it always sat in the center of the room. Road dust on the tires from the previous week's ride. Oil on the concrete beneath it. The cherry red paint catching the morning light through the bay the same way it always caught it. Deacon came in at mid-morning. He stood in front of the Indian for a moment in the way he always did. He looked at Lola. "She is good. She is good." He nodded. They stood together and the shop worked around them, and the day moved and the machines took shape under careful hands. The sun crossed the sky and came through the open bay and lit up everything inside. Harper worked at the parts bench across the room. The brass key was on the chain around her neck, tucked under her shirt, where it had always belonged. When the others had gone and the floor was clean and the tools were hung, Lola stood in the doorway of the garage and looked out at the desert going dark. She reached into her jacket pocket and found it empty. The key was where it belonged. She looked up at the first stars appearing in the east and thought about Hope Briggs at 23, sitting on number 9 at a starting line in Wisconsin in February 1937, watching a man try to prevent her from racing, waiting with a certainty that needed nothing from him or from anyone. She thought that wherever the dead went, they got to know how things turned out. She went inside and turned out the last light. Up on the hill in the garage that had stood since 1947 in a room full of trophies and photographs and the evidence of a life fully and exactly lived, number 9 waited in the dark. Patient, certain, ready for the road that has no end. Dr. Weaver shook Lola's hand at the door of the garage and said he would be in touch about transport for the cellar pieces. His sedan went back down the dirt road, and the dust from it settled slowly in the afternoon heat, and then there was only the clearing and the bikes and the riders and the work that remained. Deacon stayed 3 more days. He slept in his bedroll in the clearing the first night, as did a dozen others who had nowhere they needed to be immediately and who understood that the value of being present at a thing like this was not reducible to a single afternoon. Rampart stayed. A woman named Cress, who had been riding with the Iron Covenant for 22 years and who had a way of sitting in silence that made silence feel productive, stayed. A man named Odell, who had known Lola's husband Dale and who had come because of that and who had said nothing about it, stayed. They ate in shifts from coolers people had brought, and they drank coffee from thermoses, and they talked about motorcycles, which was what they always talked about when the larger subject had been addressed, and they were waiting for what came next. On the second evening, Rampart came into the garage and stood in front of the wall of photographs for a long time without speaking. Lola was at the bench going through the rest of the letters, the ones she had not yet read. "Those are race programs," Rampart said eventually. Lola looked up. She had not noticed the framed items mixed in among the photographs. Rampart pointed at one, and Lola walked over to look. It was a folded paper program from the 1938 Wisconsin Teat. The kind printed in bulk for events and handed out at the gate thin paper with a basic typeface and a drawing of a motorcycle on the cover. Inside was a list of competitors. H. Briggs was listed in the women's class number 7 machine, listed as Indian 4. There was a penciled check mark beside her name. Rampart pointed at another frame. 1940 Pikes Peak. Same format, same check mark beside the name. She went down the wall pointing at the programs which Lola now saw were interspersed throughout the photographs, framed and hung in sequence with the images that accompanied them. 12 of them in total, a check mark beside H. Briggs in each one. "Your grandmother framed her own race programs," Rampart said. "She did not frame the trophies. She did not put the photographs in silver frames. She framed the programs. The entry list." "Because that was the argument," Lola said. Rampart nodded. "That she had a right to be there. That she had entered and been entered and competed on the same terms as everyone else." Lola looked at the wall differently after that, at the programs interspersed among the photographs, in a pattern that now seemed deliberately composed, the argument and the evidence side by side, the name on the list and the woman in the image who had put it there. She thought about the man at the Wisconsin registration table who had tried to wave hope off the starting grid. She thought about the 2 men Thaddeus Gallagher had brought with him in 1971. She thought about Preston Gallagher yesterday with his 3 large men and his false county report. She thought about Glenn and the documents he had produced at the kitchen table and the way Harper had handed them to her with shaking hands. Different men, different methods, the same fundamental belief. She was still thinking about it when she heard a vehicle on the road the following morning, a different engine note than the bike's a car. She walked to the door. The vehicle that came up the track was a county assessor's truck, white with a government seal on the door. A woman in her 50s got out clipboard in hand and walked toward the garage with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been sent to do a job and intended to do it quickly. "My name is Aldine Marsh," she said when she reached Lola. "I am the county assessor for this district. I am here to update the property assessment on this parcel, which has been flagged as containing undisclosed improvements and historical assets." Lola looked at her. Flagged by whom? Aldine Marsh looked at her clipboard. The request originated from the county environmental office. "There is no environmental proceeding on this property. The county clerk confirmed that 2 days ago." The assessor paused and looked at her clipboard again. "I was told there was an active proceeding. By whom specifically?" A long pause. "I would need to check the internal request documentation." "I would very much like you to do that," Lola said. "And while you are checking, I would like you to note that the property owner has retained counsel who will be interested in the chain of requests that sent you up this road today." Aldine Marsh looked at Lola for a moment. Then she looked at the motorcycles in the clearing and at Deacon leaning against his Road King with his arms folded and at Rampart beside him doing the same. She looked at the open garage door. "I will need to verify the request documentation before I proceed," she said. "I will be in contact." She got back in the truck and drove back down the road. Deacon walked over. Third attempt in 3 days. Lola watched the truck go. "He is thorough, I will give him that." "Your grandmother said he would be." "Yes, she did." Deacon unfolded his arms. "I am going to make a few calls," he said. People who know things about how Gallagher Development has been operating. You do not have to do that." "I know I do not have to." He picked up his phone. "That is what makes it worth doing." He made the calls. Lola went back to the letters. The remaining letters in the box covered the years between 1971 and 1997, a span in which Hope had continued to document every contact with the Gallagher family and its representatives in the same careful notarized hand she had been using since 1962. There were 7 more letters from that period, each one describing a different approach, each one showing a slight escalation in the sophistication of the attempt. In 1978, someone had sent a letter purportedly from the State of Arizona Historic Properties Office claiming that the property had been identified as a site of archaeological significance and that access would be required for an assessment. Hope had called the actual Historic Properties Office. No such identification had been made. The letter was a forgery. She had noted the specific differences between the letterhead on the forgery and the genuine letterhead she had obtained for comparison, and she had filed both with the notary. In 1984, a real estate attorney had sent a letter on behalf of an undisclosed client offering a price that was more reasonable than the earlier offers, accompanied by carefully worded language about the legal complexity of maintaining an undisclosed historical asset and the potential liability that might attach to an estate containing unregistered items of significant value. Hope had written in the margin, as she had written in the margins of all the others, her response. In this case, she had written 3 words. Interesting? Still no. In 1992, Robert Gallagher himself had written for the first time, presenting himself as a different kind of Gallagher than his father, interested in a mutually beneficial arrangement respectful of the property's history. Hope had written beside his name in the margin where she always wrote her notes. "This one is more careful. He is also more patient. Watch him." Lola stacked the letters in chronological order and put them back in the wooden box. She thought about the 26 years of property taxes, $210 a year, that she had paid without ever putting the key in the lock. She thought about all the people who had been circling this garage during those 26 years, not knowing what was inside, only knowing that it was something worth circling. She thought about her grandmother spending those same years writing letters that nobody had read yet, notarizing documents that nobody had needed yet, watching the road below from wherever she had spent her final years, knowing the day would come when the letters and the documents and the records would matter. It had come. She picked up the journal and read the sections she had skimmed in her exhaustion of the first night, the entries that described the process of acquiring the pieces now in the cellar. The Crocker frame had come from a man in Flagstaff in 1953 who had been cleaning out his late father's property and who had found the frame in the back of a storage building and had not known what it was and had wanted $75 for it. Hope had given him $80 and had driven it home in the back of her truck wrapped in moving blankets. The Bros Superior tank had come from a dealer in Los Angeles in 1961 who had been trying to sell it for 2 years without knowing its provenance and had been asking $200. Hope had looked at it for an afternoon and read the markings and looked at the line work and gone home and come back the following day and paid the $200 without negotiating because she was certain, and negotiating would only have made him less certain that he wanted to sell. The Vincent engine had come from an estate sale in New Mexico in 1978. The family selling the estate had not known what they had and had priced it at $500 as a lot with three other items. Hope had bought the lot and given the other three items to a local museum and kept the Vincent, entry after entry, year after year. The pattern of someone who knew what she was looking for and had the patience to wait for the right piece at the right moment and the discipline to pay what was fair and not more, because overpaying attracted attention and underpaying meant the piece might go elsewhere. There was an entry from 1966 near the middle of the journal that Lola read twice. Saw a photograph in a magazine today of a woman at a rally in California riding a machine I recognized from the old circuit. Not a racer herself, just a rider. She looked at the camera the way women look at cameras when they are in a place they are not supposed to be, and they know it, and they are there anyway. I thought about going to find her. Instead, I came home and worked on the Indian. Some conversations can only happen through the machine, not around it. Lola sat with that for a long time. She thought about all the conversations she had not had with Hope in all those years, about the questions she had not asked, about the life that had been here sealed in concrete on this hillside waiting. The answer to why Hope had kept it quiet was in the journal spread across decades of entries that described the attempts to take the machine and the records kept against those attempts. She had been protecting the collection. Every person she told was a potential leak, a potential connection to the people who wanted what was here. The secrecy was not vanity or privacy or shame. It was strategy. It was the same methodical, patient, thorough strategy that had produced the race record and the medals in the 3 decades of quiet acquisition. Hope had been protecting the collection for Lola's entire life, without Lola knowing there was anything to protect. Lola set the journal down on the bench and looked at the Indian 9 in the center of the room. She thought about her grandmother at 23 winning at Daytona in 1937 on a machine she had saved 2 years to buy, and then spending the next 60 years ensuring that the machine and the record of what it meant survived long enough to matter to the right person at the right time. She thought about the right person. She thought about what it meant to be the right person. The sound of the Iron Covenant's engines in the clearing brought her back. Deacon was organizing the remaining riders for the day, coordinating with a few phone calls, making sure the property was covered without making it look like a siege. He was good at that, at the logistics of presence, at knowing how many people and what kind of presence was appropriate for a given situation. She walked out into the morning sun. Rampart was standing by the garage door with a cup of coffee, looking at the sign Lola had painted above it. Hope Briggs Workshop, established 1947. You did that fast, Rampart said. Last night, after you all turned in. It is right, Rampart said. It is exactly right. Lola looked at the sign. She thought about all the years it had not been there, all the years the garage had been a blank concrete wall with a padlocked door and no name and no history visible from the outside. She thought about painting it correctly and hanging it straight and stepping back to look at it in the lamplight at 2 in the morning and feeling something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a very long time. Your grandmother would have liked it, Rampart said. Lola thought about that for a moment. Yeah, she said. I think she would have. They stood together in the morning sun and looked at the sign and the building and the clearing where the Iron Covenant's bikes were lined up in the good morning light and did not say anything else because nothing else was needed. The seasons change the way seasons change in the high desert, not gradually, but in steps, a week of one thing and then a week of another. Heat of summer, stepping back to let in the cool of fall in a way that felt deliberate. By the time the first frost came in November, the garage had been running in a working shop for 4 months and had begun to develop the particular character of a place where real work happens, which is a character composed of dozens of small, accumulated details that no single person puts there deliberately, but that everyone who uses the space contributes to without meaning to. The floor had oil in new places from new machines. The pegboard by the welding station had developed an arrangement of tools that reflected Lacey's specific logic of use, rather than any predetermined organizational system. The workbench nearest the door had a specific area on its surface that Donna had claimed for her estimation, work stacked with sourcing catalogs and a notebook, with careful calculations and 2 colors of ink. Harrison had built a small shelf near his primary work area for the specific set of reference materials. He consulted most often manuals and parts diagrams, and a worn copy of a technical guide on pre-war American engines that he had owned for 15 years. Weston had developed a rhythm that started before the shop opened and ended after it closed. He was the first in and the last out, and he had begun without being asked to keeping a log of each machine that came through the shop, its condition on arrival, the work done, the condition at departure. He did not show Lola the log. She found it one morning on the bench and read through it and did not say anything, but the next week she bought a proper hardbound ledger and left it on his bench without a note. He understood what it meant. He transferred the existing entries into the new ledger in clean handwriting and kept going. Harper had developed her own rhythm more slowly and with more difficulty, but it was developing. There were days when the work did not go well, when a connection refused to seat correctly, or a system she thought she had understood turned out to require a step she had missed. And on those days, she would stand for a moment looking at what was wrong with her hands at her sides, and then she would go back to the diagram and start again. She did not ask for help unless she had genuinely exhausted her own resources. Lola watched and did not intervene unless the situation required it, which it less and less frequently did. There was a morning in late November, 6 weeks after Harper had first installed the carburetor on the panhead, when she arrived at the shop before Lola and was already at work when Lola came through the door. She was doing a full valve adjustment on a 1950 Indian Chief that had been sitting at the back of the shop untouched for 3 weeks because it was a complex job and the machines in more urgent need had come first. Lola stood in the doorway for a moment without announcing herself. Harper had laid out all the necessary tools in the correct order. She had the technical specifications for the job written out on a piece of paper taped to the bench beside the machine. She was working slowly and with the particular focused attention of someone who knows the job is difficult and has decided that difficulty is not a reason to avoid it. She had gotten part way through when she looked up and saw Lola. "I started on the Chief," Harper said. "I hope that is all right." Lola walked over and looked at what she had done. The disassembly was correct. The layout was correct. The specifications were the right ones for this engine. "Finish it," Lola said. Harper finished it in 4 hours. When she was done, she looked at the result, looked at the specifications, looked at Lola. "Is it right?" Lola examined the work. It was right. "Start it and find out," she said. Harper started the engine. It ran correctly. Neither of them said anything. Harper went and poured herself a cup of coffee and stood at the bench looking at the machine running, and Lola went to the next job on the list, and the morning continued. But something had shifted quietly and without announcement in the space between them. Not repaired, not resolved, but moved the way a stuck thing moves when the right amount of steady pressure has been applied for long enough. The following week, Lola put a machine on the main bench that had been waiting. A 1947 Indian Chief, a different one from the one Harper had worked on. This one, having come in from a collector in Flagstaff who had acquired it at an estate sale without a clear understanding of what kind of shape it was in. It was in poor shape, not irreparably poor, but poor in the way that machines get poor when they have been sitting for a long time and then moved without the care that long-sitting machines require. Lola had been looking at it for 2 weeks and thinking about who should take the lead on it. She had considered giving it to Harrison, who would have done it correctly and efficiently. She had considered splitting it between Weston and Lacey, which would have been both educational and practical. She had considered taking it herself. She put it on the main bench and told Harper it was hers. Harper looked at the machine for a long time. The scale of the job was visible from the outside in the things that were wrong with the bodywork and the chrome and the obvious deferred maintenance. "This is a big job," Harper said. "Yes. How long will it take?" "As long as it takes to do it correctly." Harper looked at her. "What if I make mistakes?" "You will make mistakes," Lola said. "That is what the job is for." Harper nodded. She went home that evening and came back the following morning with the technical manual for the 1947 Indian Chief that she had ordered overnight from a supplier Donna had recommended. She began the assessment process that morning, and she began the log that went with it, writing down what she found and what the correct condition should be and what the distance between them was, in the same way Weston had been writing the shop log. She made mistakes, several of them. She found most of them herself and corrected them. The ones she did not find, Lola pointed to without elaborating, and Harper went back and found them and corrected them. The Chief took 11 weeks. When it was done, it ran as it had been built to run, and Harper stood beside it in the cleared space of the main bay and looked at it with the expression of someone who has done something they were not certain they could do. Lola came and stood beside her. She said nothing. She did not need to. Deacon came up the road that afternoon on his Road King, which he did periodically, checking in on the shop the way he checked in on everything that mattered to him, without announcement and without agenda. He stood and looked at the finished Chief. "That is good work," he said. Harper looked at him. She had met him only a few times since she had come back, and she had been careful with him, as she had been careful with all the Iron Covenant riders, understanding, without being told, that these were people who had shown up when her mother needed them to show up, and that their opinion of her was something she had to earn. "Thank you," she said. Deacon looked at the machine for another moment. Then he looked at Lola. "That is good work," he said again, and they both understood he was saying it to both of them. He stayed for coffee and talked about a machine he was working on himself, a late 50s Harley that had been giving him a specific timing problem for 3 months. Harrison sat down with him, and they went back and forth on it for 40 minutes and arrived at a diagnosis. Harrison wrote it down, and Deacon folded the paper and put it in his vest pocket and left. The shop had become, over the months of its new operation, a place where problems got solved. Not just the problems of the machines, but the problems of the people who worked on them and the people who brought them in. Riders came with machines in poor condition and left with machines that ran correctly and a clearer understanding of what they had. Collectors came with questions about provenance and left with answers. Young people came with the raw material of mechanical ability and without a place to develop it, and found both a place and people willing to teach them. Tess arrived in early December. She had been riding her own machine since she was 19 and had been wrenching on it since shortly after, first out of necessity and then out of preference. She drove down from Flagstaff on a clear morning with the bike she had been riding for 6 years, a machine that showed in its condition the kind of attention that serious riders give serious machines, and she parked it in the clearing and walked into the garage and said she was looking for someone willing to teach her the old machines. Lola looked at her hands, calloused and marked the way hands get marked from doing real work. She looked at the machine outside, well-maintained, correctly maintained by someone who had learned mostly on their own and had learned correctly. "Come back tomorrow," Lola said. Tess came back. She came back every day after that. She absorbed what she was shown with the speed of someone who has already built the frame that new knowledge can hang on, and she supplemented what she was shown with independent study that she never made a point of demonstrating, but that showed up in the quality of the questions she asked. By the end of December, the shop had 5 people working in it with real skill. Weston and Lacey and Donna and Harrison, and now Tess and Harper working alongside them with growing competence. And Lola overseeing all of it, and still doing the most complex work herself, because the most complex work was what she did best, and had always done best, and there was no reason to stop. The Indian 9 rode once a month in the early mornings. Lola had developed a route east into the mountain passes that took about 90 minutes at a comfortable pace, and that she had now ridden 4 times and was beginning to know the way. She knew all familiar roads, which is to say, through the body rather than through the mind, each curve and grade and surface change stored in the muscles rather than the memory. On the 5th ride, she asked Harper to come. Harper had been riding the shop bikes for 2 months, adding distance and confidence in measured increments, never rushing toward competence, but not refusing it either. She was not ready for the Indian, but she had her own machine now, the 1948 Panhead she had been restoring, finished, and running, and hers in the way that things you have worked on with your own hands become yours. They went out on a Monday morning in January, the air cold enough for breath to show the desert pale and still before the sun cleared the ridge. Lola on the Indian, Harper on the Panhead, 50 yards back, keeping a pace that was hers rather than trying to match anything else. They rode east into the mountains as the sun came up. The road was empty. The light was the pale gold of winter mornings at altitude, and it lit the rock formations on either side of the road in a way that made them look ancient and significant, which they were. The Indian ran the way it always ran, smooth and certain, the deep familiar note of it preceding them around each curve and bouncing back off the canyon walls. Lola rode and thought about her grandmother riding the same machine east on a morning in 1943 with classified materials in the saddlebag and the same desert around her and a different kind of weight in it. She thought about what it meant to carry something important, across a landscape that would be indifferent to whether you made it or not. She thought about the difference between that weight and this one. She thought this weight was lighter and heavier at the same time. When they came back to the clearing, an hour and a half later, the others were there. Weston at the bench through the open bay, Lacey in the back with her torch. The smoke from the morning fire Donna always made when the weather was cold rising from the small pit outside. Harrison's truck in the clearing. Harper pulled in and stopped the panhead and sat on it for a moment before she swung off. She walked to Lola without speaking and looked at her with something in her face that was complicated and did not need to be named right then. Lola looked back way. They stood there for a moment in the cold morning air with the engines ticking down around them. Then Harper went inside and got to work. Lola stood for a moment in the clearing, looking at the garage and the sign above the door, and the motorcycles lined up along the side wall, in the open bay where the light fell across the floor and showed everything that was being done there. She thought about all the things that could not be repaired. The years, the money, the choices that had led to the screen door hitting the siding and the boxes tumbling down the porch steps on a morning that felt like it was the end of everything. She thought about all the things that had been repaired. She thought about Hope Briggs at 23, 25, 30 in the photographs on the back wall, alive in each of them in a way that a still image could barely contain. Alive in the trophies on the shelves, alive in the machine standing in the center of the room, alive in the journal on the shelf behind glass, alive in the brass key that was now on a chain around Harper's neck. She thought this is what she meant. This is what number 9 belongs on the road means. Not the machine itself. All of it. The work and the place and the people doing it and the road that goes on from here in every direction. She went inside and picked up a wrench and got to work. 3 years after she first put the key in the lock, Lola sat on the porch of the house at the bottom of the hill and watched the lights in the garage go off one by one. Weston was locking up. She could see his shape moving through the bay, checking each bench in turn before he hit the switches. He had grown taller in the past year and carried himself differently now, with the quiet confidence of someone who has been given responsibility and has not wasted it. The desert night settled in around her in its particular complete way, the stars emerging by hundreds and then by thousands as the last of the evening light faded from the western sky. The air smelled of sage and the particular dry cold of the high desert in winter, the cold that clarifies rather than chills. Harper came out of the garage behind Weston, and they talked briefly in the clearing. Weston pointing at something on his bike that he was apparently explaining to her, Harper nodding, asking a question, Weston demonstrating. This was their habit now, this informal teaching that happened in the margins of the workday, and it had been going on long enough that it had begun to produce results in Harper's mechanical understanding that Lola had not expected to see developing this quickly. She thought about what her grandmother had written in the journal about the first time she had taught a rider younger than herself about the Indians' particular requirements. She had written it in 1946, the year after the war, the year before she built the garage. She had written that the thing she had not expected about teaching was how much it required her to understand what she knew rather than simply knowing it. Lola thought about that. She thought about all the things she had known for 30 years that she was now in the process of understanding. The garage lights went off. The clearing went dark except for the stars and the lights Weston and Harper were carrying down the hill. They split at the bottom, Weston to his truck, Harper to the sedan she had finally been able to buy when she had saved enough. They both raised a hand toward the house, not seeing whether Lola was on the porch, just doing it out of habit because this was the end of the day, and the end of the day required acknowledgement. She raised her hand back. The engine started, and the headlights swept across the hillside, and the vehicles went down the road in opposite directions, and the night was quiet again. Lola stayed on the porch for a while longer the way she often did. She had a good view of the hill from here, and she liked knowing the garage was there, knowing what was in it, knowing that tomorrow morning that she would walk up the hill and Weston would already be there with the door unlocked and the lights on and the coffee made, and the work would continue in the direction it was going. She thought about Hope sitting somewhere in the years after the garage was built, and before the end, knowing the things were there and not being able to tell anyone and not telling anyone, knowing what she had built and what it was for and waiting for the right moment. The patience of it. Lola pulled out the pocket watch from her jacket pocket. She still carried it. She had stopped wearing it on the chain, had moved it to the jacket pocket instead, where it knocked against her hand when she reached in and reminded her it was there. She wound it 3 turns in the dark and felt the mechanism engage and knew without seeing that the second hand was moving. She thought about Hope winding the watch in 1997, winding it and setting it on the bench in the dark garage where it would sit for a year before she died, and then for 26 years after waiting, keeping its own time in the sealed dark. Some things wait, she thought. Some things are built to wait. The Indian 9 was still in the center of the room where it had stood since the day she wheeled it back onto the platform after the first ride. It was not museum still anymore. It had road dust on the tires and oil on the floor beneath it, and the small evidence of regular use that accumulates on things that are used rather than displayed. It was not a monument. It was not a memorial. It was a motorcycle, and it would be ridden tomorrow morning if the weather was right, or the morning after, because that was what number 9 was for. Lola put the pocket watch back in her pocket. She stood and went inside. Tomorrow she was going to take the Indian East again into the passes, maybe farther than she had gone before. She had been extending the route each time, adding miles, testing the machine, and herself against the longer distances and the variable grades. She thought she might take Harper out to the junction, where the canyon road met the main highway, which was a turn she had been thinking about for a while, a route that would take them both through terrain neither of them had ridden together yet. She thought about how to describe the route to Harper in the morning, which landmarks to mention, where the road changed grade, where to expect the cold pockets in the shaded sections of the canyon. She thought about all the routes her grandmother had known that were not written down, the mountain tracks and desert passes that lived only in Hope's memory and died when she died, the specific knowledge of specific roads that had been earned through riding and that could only be passed on by riding. She thought about passing things on. She thought that was the whole of it. That was what the garage was. That was what the sign above the door said and meant. Not a destination, not a monument, a place of passing on, a workshop in the oldest sense of the word, where what you knew became what someone else knew, where the machines and the knowledge and the habit of doing careful work carried forward from one pair of hands to the next, getting better with each transmission, because each person added what they knew to what they had received. Hope had known this. She had built it into the structure of the place itself, into the organization of the cellar and the journal, and the letters in the wooden box, into the single instruction she had written on a separate page 26 years before anyone would read it. Do not open it until you have nothing left. Because when you have nothing left, you are ready to receive. Because when you have nothing left, you understand what something is worth. Because when you have nothing left, you can finally see what your grandmother left you without the weight of everything you already have getting in the way. Lola had had nothing left. Now she had everything. Not the house, not the shop she had sold, not the tools or the retirement account or the credit she had spent 2 years watching somebody else destroy. Something different, something that did not diminish when it was shared but grew. She lay down in the dark and listened to the desert and thought about tomorrow's ride and the route she would take Harper on and the way the canyon road opened up after the second switchback into a long straight that you could see for miles, the kind of straight that a good machine answers with something that feels like gratitude. She closed her eyes. She thought about a specific morning, the morning 3 years ago when she had stood in the driveway of the house that was no longer hers and watched 2 polite young men carry her life out of it in labeled boxes, and had told herself that whatever was waiting at the end of a dirt road on a hillside north of town was not going to be enough to undo what had been done. She had been wrong. She had been profoundly and completely wrong in the specific and generous way that being wrong can sometimes be the best thing that happens to you. She did not think of it as luck. She thought of it as preparation. Hope Briggs had spent 60 years preparing for this, arranging things precisely, waiting with patience that Lola could now recognize as a form of love. The long, patient love of someone who sees further ahead than the people around them and spends their life building something for the people who will arrive later. It had arrived. Lola had arrived. Now it was her turn to build. In the garage on the hill, the Indian 9 waited in the dark with the patience of something that has been waiting its entire life and has never once doubted that the road would come. The road always came.